All right, so I have a trillion slides we're going to go through as fast as possible. So, there's plenty of information on me online. You can visit SeanSherman.com if you want to. We were having lots of technical difficulties with this one, but I'm just going to kind of just go through and start. So I was born and raised in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux Tribe. My business is currently in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I have a nonprofit and a restaurant that I'll talk about as we go through all this. And mostly I do this talk all over the place, and I just really want to help share the philosophy that we have around looking at modern indigenous foods in today's world and addressing some of the very serious issues about food access, and just helping to spread indigenous knowledge moving forward and ways that we can help steward that knowledge as a whole. So basically, can't see my next slide, so I'm just gonna, well, it'll be a surprise, but not really, as we kind of go through it. Which one is my button here to move forward with? Down? Okay, there we go, that's me. Anyways, Pine Ridge is a pretty large reservation. It's the third largest reservation in the United States. The original treaty land gave us a much larger space than the orange, but still today Pine Ridge Reservation has a lot of issues, a lot of economic issues. It's probably still about 85% unemployment there. I saw a statistic that the average take-home wage of somebody living on Pine Ridge, South Dakota, where a lot of my family lives, is about $6,500 a year. And there's very little food nutrition access out there, and that's just what I grew up with, which is part of the reason I do the work that I'm doing right now, because a lot of things have to change. I became a very young chef. I started cooking in restaurants in the Black Hills. My mom moved us off the reservation when I was about 12 years old. I started working in restaurants when I was 13, and I just continued to work restaurants through high school and college. After college, I moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I moved my way up into a chef position at a very young age. And I had a very good chef career, but it was a few years into that chef career that I basically realized the complete absence of indigenous foods out there anywhere. There was very few cookbooks on the subject. There's no indigenous chefs on TV. I couldn't find any indigenous restaurants at the time when I was looking for them. So it set me on a path to just understand, the food of my ancestry, and just the realization, just trying to answer, like, what are indigenous foods, and why did we lose so much knowledge? And looking at the time frame of it, because I was born in 1974, I looked 100 years before my birth in 1874, and all my Lakota ancestors had 100% of their indigenous education intact at that time period in history, because they don't discover gold in the Black Hills until 1876. So within a single century, less than a single century, we lose so much knowledge, and it became a quest to understand what we lost to be able to move forward. So trying to understand, there was very little information on the subject, like I said, because I couldn't go online and buy Joy of Native American Cooking, because that just didn't exist. And I just had to really focus on, what were my ancestors eating, what were they harvesting, because it wasn't the food that I grew up with, we definitely weren't eating Jell-O molds and lunch and loaf and things like that. So I really wanted to understand, what were we truly eating, what were we harvesting, what was our knowledge of plants, when to harvest, how to harvest, which parts to harvest. Were we growing? Were we trading? What was our cooking techniques? What were our food preservation techniques? So many questions through a culinary lens that I wanted to answer for myself. So it came to a realization that this also became a study not only in all of this knowledge base, but also a huge study of history as to what happened to us. And it really just became a study of just naming what happened to us in general. So when I started coming out, I started my company in 2014, and I just really wanted to showcase what was possible. And I started getting a lot of press right away as a chef doing indigenous foods, and people would ask, they'd be like, oh, Native American food, never heard of it, cool, what is it? And I realized people didn't understand what I was talking about when I was trying to say I'm trying to do pre-colonial foods, pre-reservation foods, things like that. So I always like to start this talk at the very beginning of how do you understand these terms? What does it mean to decolonize? What are pre-colonial foods, right? So the easiest way to understand it is you have to understand just the term colonialism just to start with. So I think it's just a good base for us all. The easiest way to understand colonialism is just to Google it. So if you Google the term colonialism, you'll get this definition: the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying with settlers, exploiting it economically, which is something that is not unique to North America. It has happened all over the globe, especially coming from European powers and largely British colonialism too, which has affected so many of us on a global scale. because it's North America, South America, the Middle East, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, South Pacific, Hawaii, name it. Everywhere, colonialism has just affected people in a very short time period in human history, and disrupting so much global, amazing knowledge of the world around us. Because one commonality as indigenous peoples on a global scale is that we have the ability to live sustainably utilizing the world around us with primarily plant knowledge when it comes down to it. So for me, this also just sets, understanding this sets off a large history that just is full of racism and Eurocentric white supremacy, including our own academia, you know, and we just really need to start to see other perspectives, and that's why it's really important to understand indigenous perspectives when we're moving into things and realizing that Eurocentric academia is not the only way, that there's many different perspectives for us to learn. And you know, a lot of times Eurocentric academia is utilizing another form of colonizing by basically Columbusing our own knowledge, you know, and claiming it for themselves. And so I just really like to think about the history of where we are, because our country is very young. Like United States, you know, I look at the late 1700s, but really I look at the 2 centuries of 1800 and 1900s to understand what happened to us as indigenous peoples, and why we don't have Native American restaurants in every single city, and why we have very little access to indigenous foods, even though no matter where we are, we're standing on indigenous land and it's all around us, right? So, you know, this government was very racist against us as indigenous peoples, because the only value that we had as indigenous peoples was the land that we stood upon. Nobody took the time to learn from us, or really learn, except for the early agriculture that happens in the very beginning of the East Coast. But you have to remember that the United States government is this very short story, you know, because it starts in, you know, at the year 1800, we're still basically the 13 colonies. Ohio is the western frontier at this point in time. We're still at war with Great Britain, we're still at war with France, and nothing has really changed that much. But during this one century between 1800 and 1900, things changed dramatically, and it becomes really intense and really violent towards indigenous peoples living across this land space. A lot of this starts with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which gives the United States government the framework and the groundwork and the ability to justify the theft of stolen indigenous land spaces. So if you don't know what this ordinance means, you would very clearly see it if you fly over to the east, you know. So all this grid work that you see is a direct result of the Northwest Ordinance that really set out how land was taken, parceled out, commodified, sold, and the United States makes an intense amount of money off of all this stolen land space. And it's just a huge part of the colonial machine moving forward. We don't even really define our borders, you know, because during this time period in the early 1800s, the reality is most indigenous communities across North America haven't even seen European people yet, and are still stewarding the land spaces, even though European powers are taking vast claims and saying they now own this space, right? And so again, like, we don't even really form our colonial border, southern border, at least until the middle of that century. So again, this is very recent history when it comes down to things. And then I'm just gonna skip this video, but you guys should find this video. It just showcases how fast the United States government takes over land space. And it's worth watching, and I can find a link that I can give to you guys later to watch it. But it's pretty intense, because during that one century, over 80% of that land mass is still stewarded by indigenous peoples. By the end of that century, only 2% of land is held by indigenous peoples, only because of the reservation systems. And it's still in danger today when it comes down to it. So during this time period of the colonial machine in the 1800s, we're seeing an immense amount of environmental destruction across the board. I just imagine what a lot of our forests would look like if we had old growth everywhere still, you know, but entire states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Washington State, just being completely mowed down for the sake of this. And, you know, what do we have, like probably 6% of old growth redwoods left alive, if even at this point, you know. So we could have learned so much from indigenous peoples if we had taken the time. And we have no idea how much destruction of seed diversity we lost during this push also, because there was so much amazing agriculture happening across North America. You know, the eastern tribes especially were extremely advanced with their townships and the agriculture that they were growing. The first president of the United States, George Washington, his first order sends General Sullivan out for the complete and total destruction of all the settlements in the Northeast in retaliation to some of them siding with the British government. General Sullivan does that in 1787. And you can read about people who were alongside there, first-hand witnesses of how they're destroying these massive townships, and they're destroying, up to 6 miles of agricultural farm fields around each of these settlements, and so much advanced agriculture happening at this time period. And they do this in a single summer, just between May and September. So today in Haudenosaunee language, the literal translation for US president means town destroyer still because of that history. And that just kind of sets the tone how the US government treats indigenous peoples for the rest of that century. We see things like the Indian Removal Act, the Homestead Act of 1862, the Morrill Act of 1862, which creates land grant colleges, which really should be called land grab colleges. Indian Appropriation Act of 1871, Dawes Act of 1887, and so forth. And each of those is disempowering indigenous people, justifying the violence and the theft of their land spaces. And we see so much in just loss of food access in general as indigenous peoples, because we learn about how the bison almost went extinct, but we don't talk about, the US government does not talk about how they did that purposefully, because they decided that it was going to be cheaper to take out their food source than to commit all-out genocide, and you can find a lot of that writing in Congresses too. And it's just a really intense century when it comes down to it, and there's all sorts of snippets of history that just showcases the facts of what actually happens during this time period. But what's most damaging to us as indigenous peoples was the loss of our own education. So if you take the time to identify what is indigenous education, it should have been the thousands of generations of knowledge that would have been handed down to us as indigenous people, giving us the tools to live sustainably with the world around us. Right? And instead we're forced into assimilation, so this would have been my grandparents' era at the turn of the century, who were the first round of kids to go through boarding school systems, and trying to turn us into civilized people, but this just creates an entire generation of trauma because these kids that are forced into these boarding schools are faced with all sorts of physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, and death. Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania is the first of these schools. There's a massive graveyard, which is just a small portion of what it used to be. And if anybody has watched the news in the past few years as they started searching the grounds of residential schools in Canada and finding hundreds of unmarked graves within just a few of those. So again, just so much violence of these schools that pop up all over the place. And the residential schools in Canada were going on until the 1990s. And just, forcing us to learn different religions and forcing us just to become something that we're not supposed to be. So for us in the 1900s, it doesn't get much better. We're not citizens until 1924. They also have to create legislation to segregate us. So the Racial Integrity Act happens also in 1924. We go through a few decades of Indian termination and relocation policies, which is just more land grabbing basically for resources. We see the Indian adoption era from 1941 to 1967. To me, this is another form of genocide. It's cultural genocide because during this time period, 1 out of 3 indigenous peoples are pulled from their families and communities, put into non-indigenous homes, which further separates us from our indigenous ancestry. We can't vote like many people of color until 1965. We can't even celebrate our own religions until 1978, which is within my lifetime, in a country that's always going on about freedom of religion. It just did not apply to the first peoples that lived here. So post-colonial Native America, when I was growing up, journalists always asked me, like, what did you eat? You grew up on a reservation, you're a native chef, because they want to hear the cool story about how I'd get up in the morning, form a sling, take down an elk, feed a whole family, grab a bunch of things along the way. But that's not the truth because I grew up in a very colonized state. Reservations are still very much segregated communities in today's world. And I grew up with the commodity food program. So this is a lot of the stuff, and a lot of these look familiar to a lot of us. But this is not a healthy food base to survive off of. And some of our communities are suffering from up to 60% type 2 diabetes because of this exact food base. So there's a lot of change that has to happen, a lot of education that has to happen. And when I was growing up, we didn't even get those pretty pictures and colors. It was just things like beef with juices, pork with juices, chicken with juices, and it's that with juices that really sells that product, right? And Indian tacos, like some people obviously go straight to this when they think about Native American food, but this really has nothing to do with us because we decolonized this. We didn't have wheat flour to make that. That was shown to us from the military. We didn't have ground beef, but you can pick a different animal if you want to. We definitely didn't have weird California black olives, dairy products. But so there's so much more to it, So understanding indigenous food systems is an understanding of diversity. So if you look at just the biodiversity and ecoregions of North America, we're extremely diverse, as you guys would know. And if you layer indigenous peoples on there, one way to see that is through indigenous language maps. So if you look at indigenous language maps, these are still very generalized because there's a whole bunch of indigenous diversity amongst even these huge color blocks. But we have a vision of one day being able to travel across this whole continent and experiencing indigenous foods and indigenous diversity everywhere. There's no reason why we shouldn't. And it shouldn't. Indigenous foods shouldn't be so ironically foreign to us. It should be around everywhere we are. Because there's a lot of indigeneity across North America, 634 tribes in Canada, 574 in the US, 20% of Mexico identifies as indigenous, and almost 10% of Mexico speaks indigenous languages over Spanish. And it doesn't matter who's speaking Spanish, French, or English, those are all foreign languages to this land space. English is a foreign language on this land. And we have to remember the immense diversity that lays across North America when it comes down to it. So that's why education is so important, to look at it from an indigenous perspective. So when we're looking at indigenous knowledge and indigenous education, it encompasses all of these pieces: wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, whole animal butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat productions, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, metallurgy, indigenous history, star knowledge, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, and more. There's so much perspective to look at from an indigenous knowledge base. And so many amazing foods come from the Americas that we should be very proud of and should be really focused on. And so many other continents across the world have taken these foods to be part of their own and become some of their own traditional food bases, But these things come from here, and we should be very proud of the foods that came from the Americas. So looking at foods, proteins is the easiest piece for me because any animal is literally game. In my restaurant, we cut out colonial ingredients, so we don't serve anything that Europeans brought over, so there's no beef, there's no pork, there's no chicken, there's no dairy products, there's no wheat flour, there's no cane sugar, and it's just focused on the foods of where we happen to be. But animals are easy. Anything running around there is game, right? And, we learn about how indigenous peoples utilized every part of the bison, but that's more of a lesson of being resourceful because we didn't have the privilege to be wasteful like we are today, where we literally buy something and throw it away moments later. And we because we had thousands of generations of knowledge giving us the ability to know what to do with every single part of these animals, and we applied that to all animals that we broke down, and plants too at the same time, because we had thousands of generations of knowledge and that privilege to be able to understand what to do with everything. People should not be afraid of proteins if it's not a cow, a pig, or a chicken. There's so much amazing proteins out there. Even insects. I put insects on my menu in Minneapolis, and we sell a lot of insects, and people are willing to try them, and I think that we just need to be a lot more open with what kind of foods we utilize and have access to. Plant knowledge for me is what really connects me with my ancestry, because when we open up our eyes, we just see food and medicine everywhere, I like to tease that our kids today can name more of Kim Kardashian's ex-boyfriends than they can tree species right now. So we need to be really considerate as to what our knowledge and education that we're passing down is and what's really important. So we need to connect, and we need to understand what kind of plants were people utilizing to eat, because as humans we need building blocks. We need carbohydrates or fats to survive off of, and there's so many things. That was a timsala, this is camas root, wild rice in Minnesota, for example. All these are very important, life-giving starches and pieces for us to utilize, Our extent knowledge of seaweeds and plants in the water, because if you're living on the coastal regions, you have a whole other food source right off the shore that indigenous peoples were utilizing forever. Or if you're in the desert where all the plants look like they want to hurt you and maim you, everybody knows very well how to utilize, because it's almost silly to use the term food desert, because indigenous peoples in the desert saw nothing but food and medicine all around them because they had a different lens to look at, They saw plant relatives everywhere, and all they saw was food and medicine. So there's so much, and then agriculture is another huge piece, because we're taught that this is the epitome and the pinnacle of modern day industrial agriculture, but we know what this is doing, and it's dangerous, because we're just guinea pigs when it comes down to seeing what's going to happen after we micro-ingest Roundup, for the next, couple of decades, and what's going to happen to us. It's going to be scary, So when we see things like how worried should be that glyphosate was in our Cheerios, you guys should be super worried about that. That stuff is super, super scary, and you can't even get away with it because it's in everything in the middle of your grocery store, unless you know exactly where your food is coming from. It's in everything. So looking at indigenous agriculture is really important, because indigenous agriculture spread in a vast area before European colonialism happens to North America, throughout a large chunk of Mexico, throughout the entire Caribbean, obviously down into South America, but all the way up the Mississippi, Missouri River valleys, up the east coastline into parts of Canada. So much amazing agriculture was happening across the board in North America. And you can trace it. You can trace the corn culture as it comes from Mexico, because way down in Mexico, they're growing corns and beans and squash and chilies and things like that. This is a Zuni farm in New Mexico where they figure out how to farm and cultivate all these pieces in the middle of the desert and irrigate all of that. We learn about Three Sisters, which is the corn, and you plant the beans to call up the corn and the squash to protect the ground. But this is a very East Coast style gardening system. There wasn't just one way for Native American gardening because we had so much diversity. This is Buffalo Bird Woman. She's a Hidatsa woman. You can see the Missouri River Valley in the background, and she's using more of a row system, but she's growing the same things way up there almost into Canada that they were growing way down in Mexico, So that spread of seeds is amazing to think about, because each of these seeds comes from very particular people, from very particular traditions, and very particular stories. So we need to steward these seeds. We need to make sure that these seeds stay in the hands of indigenous peoples, because they're the ones that have the connection to them. They're the ones that have been carrying them for so long. These are our relatives also. So we have to protect this diversity at all costs, because there's large companies, as you know, out there trying to buy up all this diversity, trademark it, because they just want to control your food, because they want to control you. And we should not let that happen. So today, what we're trying to do is just understand, how do we utilize all this knowledge in today's world and connect with our ancestry, and how do we just see the world differently? How do we utilize everything? So when I started my businesses, we just started making our own pantry items. It's not that hard to collect things in season, to dry things out, to grind things up, and just to make food taste like we're a place, wherever you might happen to be. There's cedar, wild rice, cranberries, maple, rabbit. You can literally stand in one spot and around where I'm at in Minnesota, look around and see all those ingredients around you. And it's just about how do we get this out there to the people, because I'm not doing this just for capitalism, just to make money. It's just something that needs to be out there and change. We need to get this into the communities. So many indigenous communities don't have access to their own foods and haven't for almost a century. And we can change that, because we can reconnect our ancestry no matter where we're from around the world, to start to eat healthier, to eat more like our ancestors, to be better. So the companies that I started, like the Sioux Chef, our food truck, Tatanka truck, all of these things, we're gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free. We're just all of these pieces. We're like what every diet's trying to get to, and it just happens to be the indigenous diet of North America, and it happens to be also extremely diverse on top of that. Our restaurant in Wamni, we're probably one of the only decolonized restaurants in the entire nation, led by indigenous peoples. We won the James Beard Award for Best New Restaurant in the U.S. last year, which is huge, because typically those awards go towards European chefs making European foods, and we need to stand out. And so we're just happy to be role models. So most of my work falls under my nonprofit Natives, which is a 501c3, which is an acronym, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. Our two main goals is creating access to Indigenous education and creating access to Indigenous foods. We're doing that through Indigenous Food Lab, which is our public model, and we just finished our first model in Minneapolis. And we're all about trying to create a whole bunch of curriculum to showcase an indigenous perspective of education. Now we're going to be able to teach a whole bunch of classes. We're going to be doing a lot of video work and putting that online very soon. We just opened up our market and classroom just a couple weeks ago, and we're really excited. This model we're hoping to grow and spread all over the place. And just share the benefits of eating healthier indigenous foods to help curb a lot of the health issues that we have out there. And just showcasing and trying to figure out solutions of how we get to true food sovereignty, and how we get to it. Because we should not allow government and politicians to control our food or our education, because you know where that's going to go, and it's not going to be good, And our goal is to open up indigenous food labs all across North America, crossing colonial borders, being regional center points to help develop more healthy food operations for tribal communities, for indigenous entrepreneurs, just to be a support system, basically. And eventually we can cross colonial borders all over the place. We can be overseas everywhere, basically, and start to help with people. We've already been working in Hawaii, we've been working in, we did some work in Australia, and there's a whole bunch of work that we can be doing on a global scale. We just want to teach people how to grow better seeds and more culturally appropriate foods, and just utilize land space better. Really showcasing what's the value of permaculture, right? Because lawns are fucking stupid, and we should be putting food better. Yes. Because otherwise we get this, if you go to Palm Springs, there's 120 golf courses in Palm Springs. That's insane, right? And they're in the middle of water crisis, and that's going to be bad. And if we've spent this much time and resource and energy on, instead of making golfers happy, and instead switching this over to producing food, that one township in the middle of the desert could probably produce enough food for all the food needs in California alone, So we have to be way smarter as humans because we're not there yet at all. And we really need a lot of education around commercial kitchens and pieces like that so people can help create these foods in a healthy manner, because food safety is really important, you know? So we just truly believe if you control your food, you can control your destiny, and we have to maintain that power moving forward. So part of our philosophy is trying to purchase from indigenous food producers locally and then nationally, no matter where we are, to help push a lot of food dollars. And just with 2 kitchens in Minnesota, we're spending tens and tens of thousands of dollars on indigenous foods directly to indigenous food producers, and it's growing fast because we're creating a demand. And it's fun because as chefs we get creative. Try making a dessert without dairy and eggs and sugar, you know, but we can do it. And so we just believe that the future is indigenous, but we just need to be there together to do it. So that's my talk. I usually do that in about an hour. There's more into it, but it's squeezed that in. So thank you so much.